The gunshot echoed across the red canyon walls, its sharp crack cutting through the desert silence like a blade. James Walker lowered his rifle smoke still curling from the barrel in the scorching Arizona heat. The wounded deer had been suffering for hours, its legs shattered by some predator's attack, and there was nothing else to be done. He knelt beside the fallen animal, his weathered hand resting on its still warm flank. "Sorry, girl," he murmured, his voice hoarse from disuse. The words seemed to hang in the thin desert air before being swallowed by the vast emptiness surrounding him. This was the fourth animal he'd found this week, all in various states of distress, from the brutal drought that had gripped the territory for 3 years running. The waterholes were dry, the grass brittle as old parchment, and even the hardiest desert creatures were struggling to survive. James stood slowly, his joints protesting with a familiar ache that belonged to a man who'd seen too much of war and hardship. At 38, James Walker was a ghost of the man who'd ridden off to fight in the Mexican War 15 years earlier. The conflict had carved deep lines into his face and left him with a permanent limp from a saber wound at Buena Vista. But it was the loss of his wife Sarah to cholera 2 winters past that had truly broken something inside him. She lay buried on the hill behind their small ranch house, marked by a simple wooden cross that he'd carved with his own hands. The ranch itself was little more than a stubborn dream now. The cattle were long gone, sold off one by one to pay debts and buy supplies. The few remaining chickens pecked at the hard-packed earth around the adobe house, finding little to sustain them. James survived on occasional work in town, fixing tools at the blacksmith shop, or helping with the harvest when there was one to speak of. He slung the rifle across his shoulder and began the long walk back toward his property, following a narrow trail that wound between towering saguaro cacti and jagged rock formations. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning his worn leather vest into a furnace against his back. In the distance, dust devils danced across the desert floor like spirits of the damned. As he crested a low ridge, James could see his house nestled in a small valley, its adobe walls the same sun-bleached color as the surrounding landscape. Smoke should have been rising from the chimney, but the hearth had been cold for days. Firewood was precious, now reserved for the coldest desert nights, when the temperature plummeted without warning. He was still a quarter-mile from home when he spotted them, 2 small figures huddled against the side of his well. Even from a distance, he could see they were children, their dark clothing stark against the pale earth. James quickened his pace, one hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver at his hip. Strangers were rare in this isolated corner of the territory, and children traveling alone were almost unheard of. As he drew closer, details became clearer. A girl, perhaps 7 years old, sat with her back against the stone well, her arms wrapped protectively around a smaller boy. Their clothes were torn and travel-stained, their faces gaunt with hunger and exhaustion. The girl looked up as James approached, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and wariness. "Please, mister," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. "We ain't eaten in 3 days. Could you spare some food?" James stopped a few paces away, studying the children carefully. The girl had dark hair that hung in tangled strands around her thin face, while the boy appeared to be no more than 3, his large eyes staring blankly at nothing in particular. Both children were desperately thin, their clothes hanging loose on their small frames. "Where are your folks?" James asked, his voice gentler than it had been in months. The girl's chin trembled slightly. "Dead, sir. Mama died of the fever 2 weeks back. Papa?" She hesitated, glancing protectively at the boy. "Papa ain't been around for a long time." James felt something stir in his chest, an emotion he'd tried to bury, along with Sarah. He looked at the boy, who hadn't spoken a word, but continued to cling to his sister's ragged dress. "What are your names?" "I'm Mary," the girl replied, straightening her shoulders with visible effort. "This here's my brother Samuel. He don't talk much since Mama got sick." The practical part of James's mind cataloged the problems these children represented. He had barely enough food to keep himself alive, no money to spare, and no experience caring for young ones. The sensible thing would be to direct them to town, to the church or the sheriff, someone better equipped to handle orphan children. But as he looked at Mary's determined face and Samuel's vacant stare, James found himself remembering another time, another place. A field hospital near Monterey, where dying soldiers had called out for their mothers in voices no different from these children's whispers. He'd been helpless then, too, able only to offer water and empty comfort to boys who would never see home again. "Come on," he said finally, surprising himself with the decision. "Let's get you inside and see what we can find to eat." Mary's eyes widened with disbelief. "You mean it? You'll help us?" James nodded toward the house. "Food first, questions later." The interior of the adobe house was sparse but clean, a single large room with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, and 2 chairs James had built himself. Mary helped Samuel to one of the chairs while James rummaged through his meager supplies. A half loaf of bread, some dried beans, a small piece of salt pork that represented his rations for the next 3 days. He cut the bread into 3 pieces, hesitating only briefly before giving the largest portion to Samuel. The boy accepted it with both hands, eating slowly but steadily, while Mary watched him with the protective intensity of someone far older than her years. "When did you last eat?" James asked, ladling water from a clay pitcher into tin cups. "Day before yesterday," Mary replied. "We found some berries along the creek, but they were mostly dried up." She took a careful sip of water, then added, "We've been walking for near a week, looking for someone who might help." James felt a familiar tightness in his chest. "Where did you come from?" Mary's expression grew guarded. "East of here. Mama worked at a way station before she got sick." She glanced at Samuel, who had finished his bread, and was now staring at James with curious eyes. "We heard there were folks in this direction who might take in children." The story felt incomplete, but James didn't press for details. He'd learned in the war that some truths came in their own time, and pushing too hard often drove people deeper into silence. Instead, he opened a can of peaches he'd been saving for a special occasion that never seemed to come. The children ate with quiet desperation, Mary carefully dividing her portion with Samuel, despite her own obvious hunger. When they finished, both children looked slightly more alert, though exhaustion still weighed heavy on their young faces. "You can sleep here tonight," James said, pulling blankets from a wooden chest. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." Mary helped Samuel wrap himself in one of the blankets, then looked up at James with solemn eyes. "Thank you, mister. Mama always said there were good people left in the world, but we'd begun to wonder." As the children settled down near the fireplace, James found himself unable to sleep. He sat in his chair, watching over them as they finally succumbed to exhaustion. Samuel curled against his sister's side, while Mary maintained her protective vigil even in slumber. Something about their presence had awakened feelings James thought he'd buried with Sarah. Not just sympathy for their plight, but a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. For the first time since his wife's death, he was thinking beyond mere survival. Dawn came with its usual harsh brightness, the desert sun painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. James had managed only fitful sleep, his mind churning with questions about the children and what he should do with them. Mary was already awake, sitting quietly beside her still sleeping brother, her eyes alert despite her exhaustion. "Morning," she said softly, careful not to wake Samuel. James nodded, moving to restart the fire. "How are you feeling?" "Better, thank you." Mary glanced around the sparse room. "You live here all alone?" "I do now." James didn't elaborate, but something in his tone must have conveyed the weight of loss, because Mary's expression softened with understanding. "Mama said being alone was the hardest thing," she offered quietly. "Harder than being hungry or scared." The simple observation struck James unexpectedly. This child, barely 7 years old, seemed to possess an intuitive wisdom born of hardship. "Your mother sounds like she was a smart woman," Mary smiled for the first time since he'd met her. She was. She could read and write and knew all kinds of things about healing. Her expression grew sad again. She tried to get better, but the fever was too strong. Samuel stirred, blinking up at them with eyes that seemed older than his years. He sat up slowly, taking in his surroundings, with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned not to trust unfamiliar places. "It's all right, Sammy." Mary soothed, using a pet name that spoke of deep affection. "This is Mr." She looked at James expectantly. "Walker, James Walker. Mr. Walker gave us food and a place to sleep. Remember?" Samuel nodded solemnly, but remained silent, his small hand finding Mary's for reassurance. James prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and the last of his coffee, watching as the children ate with the same careful gratitude as the night before. Both looked slightly better after rest and food, though they remained painfully thin. "Mary," he said carefully, "I need to ask you some questions about where you came from and what happened to your folks." The girl's posture stiffened slightly, but she nodded. "I'll tell you what I can. Your mother worked at a way station." "Which one?" Mary hesitated. "Mama called it Thompson Station, about 2 days' ride southeast of here. But that weren't her real name she used there." James felt a chill of recognition. Thompson Station was known throughout the territory as a rough place frequented by outlaws, deserters, and men running from their pasts. It was no place for a woman with children. Why did she use a false name? Mary's eyes darted to Samuel, who was listening intently despite his silence. "She was hiding from someone. Someone who hurt us before." Her voice dropped to a whisper. Samuel's father. The pieces began forming a pattern in James's mind. A woman fleeing an abusive man, taking work at a remote way station where questions weren't asked, living under an assumed name to protect her children. It was a story as old as the frontier itself. "And this man," James said carefully, "might he come looking for you?" Mary's face paled. "Mama said he would never find us out here, that we were safe. But..." She trailed off, uncertainty clear in her young voice. "But..." Before she died, she got real scared. Kept saying someone had been asking questions about us in town. A man in fancy clothes with gold teeth. James felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. Gold teeth were memorable in a place like this, and there was only one man in the territory who fit that description, Frank Thompson, owner of the way station where Mary's mother had worked. The irony of the shared name wasn't lost on him, but coincidences were common on the frontier where many people chose new identities. But Frank Thompson wasn't just a station owner. He was known to have connections with some of the most dangerous men in the territory, and rumors suggested his legitimate business was just a front for less legal activities. If he was looking for these children, it meant trouble of the worst kind. "Mary," James said quietly, "I need you to tell me everything you remember about this man with the gold teeth. Every detail, no matter how small." Over the next hour, Mary painted a picture that confirmed James's worst fears. The man she described wasn't just dangerous. He was methodical, patient, and had resources at his disposal. If he wanted Samuel for some reason, he wouldn't give up easily. "Why would he want to find you?" James asked finally. Mary's expression grew troubled. "Mama never said exactly, but I heard her talking to herself sometimes when she thought I was sleeping. Something about Samuel being worth a lot of money to someone." She looked at her little brother with fierce protectiveness. "But Samuel's just a baby. He ain't worth nothing to nobody except me." James studied the boy, who was quietly stacking small stones he'd found on the floor. There was nothing obviously special about him. Just a thin, silent child who'd endured more than his share of hardship. But in James's experience, when dangerous men pursued children, it usually involved inheritance, family secrets, or blood feuds that stretched back generations. A sound outside interrupted his thoughts. the distant rumble of hoofbeats approaching fast. James was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, motioning for the children to move away from the windows. "Stay down," he whispered, peering through a crack in the wooden shutters. 3 riders were approaching from the east, their horses lathered with sweat from hard travel. Even from a distance, James could see they weren't ordinary travelers. They rode with the easy confidence of men accustomed to violence, their hands resting casually near their weapons. The lead rider was a tall man in a black suit, his silver hair gleaming in the morning sun. James recognized him immediately, Frank Thompson himself, looking every inch the prosperous businessman despite the dust of hard travel. The 2 men flanking him were obvious hired guns, their faces hard and scarred from countless fights. James cursed under his breath. Somehow Thompson had tracked the children here faster than should have been possible. Either he'd been following them closely, or he had sources of information James didn't understand. "Mr. Walker." Mary's voice was barely a whisper, but he could hear the terror in it. "It's him, isn't it? The man with gold teeth." James nodded grimly. "Take Samuel to the root cellar behind the house. There's a tunnel that leads to the creek bed. If things go bad, follow it downstream until you reach the old mine shaft. Hide there until I come for you." Mary's eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded with the grim determination of someone who'd learned to follow instructions when survival was at stake. She gathered Samuel in her arms and slipped out the back door while James positioned himself at the front window. Thompson and his men dismounted casually, their movements unhurried and confident. They'd found what they were looking for, and they knew James was outnumbered and outgunned. The tall man approached the front door while his companions spread out to cover the sides of the house. "Mr. Walker." Thompson called out, his voice carrying the cultured accent of education and breeding. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." James remained silent, rifle trained on the door. "I know you're in there," Thompson continued. "And I know you have the children. I'm not unreasonable, man, Walker. All I want is the boy. The girl can stay with you if you've grown attached to her." The casual way he dismissed Mary, as if she were property to be traded, ignited a cold fury in James's chest. "Get off my land," he called back. Thompson's laugh was genuinely amused. "Your land? That's interesting. You see, I've done some research on you, Mr. Walker. Seems you owe quite a bit of money to Harold Mills at the Territorial Bank. In fact, I believe your mortgage payments are several months in arrears." James felt his blood turn to ice. Mills had been pressuring him for months, threatening foreclosure if he couldn't catch up on his payments. But how did Thompson know about his financial troubles? "Mills and I have come to an understanding," Thompson continued. "He gets his money, I get the boy, and you get to keep breathing. Everyone wins." "What do you want with Samuel?" James demanded. "Let's just say he's more valuable than he appears. His late mother wasn't entirely truthful about his parentage, you see. The boy has connections that could prove quite profitable." James felt the pieces clicking into place. Samuel wasn't just some anonymous orphan. He was connected to money or power in ways that made him worth pursuing across the territory. And Thompson, with his network of contacts and resources, had somehow discovered this connection. "The boy stays with me," James said firmly. Thompson sighed theatrically. "I was hoping you'd be reasonable, Walker. But I suppose we'll have to do this the hard way." The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. One of Thompson's men kicked in the back door, while the other smashed through a side window. Thompson himself charged through the front, a heavy Colt revolver in his hand. James had prepared for this possibility, using his military training to position furniture as makeshift barricades. He rolled behind an overturned table as bullets splintered the wood around him, then came up firing. His first shot took down the man at the window, spinning him backward into the desert dust. The second gunman was advancing through the back door when James's rifle cracked again. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, sending his aim wild as he staggered against the doorframe. But Thompson was the real threat. The tall man moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to gunfights, his revolver speaking with deadly precision. A bullet grazed James's left arm, sending fire through his shoulder as he dove for better cover. "Give me the boy, Walker," Thompson called during a lull in the shooting. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. This doesn't have to end with your death." James checked his ammunition. 4 shots left in the rifle, 6 in his revolver. Not enough for a prolonged fight, especially if Thompson had more men waiting outside. But he'd held worse positions during the war, and he had something now that he'd lacked, and then a reason to fight beyond mere duty. The wounded gunman was trying to flank him, moving slowly but determinedly, despite his injury. James waited until the man exposed himself, then put a bullet through his chest. The sound echoed through the small house like thunder. That left only Thompson, who had taken cover behind the stone fireplace. The man was a skilled fighter, but he was also methodical patient. He would wait for James to make a mistake rather than rush into an uncertain situation. "You know, Walker," Thompson called conversationally, "I've learned quite a bit about you in the past few days. Mexican war veteran, lost your wife to cholera, been drinking yourself to death ever since. Not exactly what I'd call father material." James said nothing, conserving his ammunition and watching for an opening. "The boy's real father was a very wealthy man," Thompson continued. "Railroad money, mining investments, cattle ranches across 3 territories. When he died last year, he left everything to his son. A son he never knew existed." The revelation hit James like a physical blow. Samuel wasn't just valuable. He was heir to a fortune that men would kill for. And Thompson somehow had discovered this secret that Mary's mother had died protecting. "Of course, the boy needs a legal guardian to access his inheritance," Thompson went on. "Someone the courts would recognize as having his best interests at heart. Someone like, say, his stepfather, who's been caring for him all these years." "You're not his stepfather," James said, understanding dawning. "Legal documents can be arranged. Witnesses found. The boy's too young to contradict testimony, and the girl." Thompson's voice turned cold. "Well, accidents happen on the frontier." The casual threat against Mary shattered the last of James's restraint. He came up from behind, his barricade rifle blazing. His first shot splintered stone inches from Thompson's head, driving the man deeper into cover. But Thompson was already moving, rolling away from the fireplace, toward a position that would give him a clear shot. James fired again, the bullet striking sparks from the stone floor where Thompson had been a split second before. The range was too close for rifle work now. James dropped the long gun and drew his Colt, advancing on Thompson's position with the steady determination of a man who'd learned to kill efficiently and without hesitation. Thompson rose from cover, his own revolver coming up fast. For a heartbeat, the 2 men faced each other across the small room, time seeming to slow as each sought the split-second advantage that would mean the difference between life and death. James fired first, but Thompson was already moving. The bullet grazed the tall man's ribs, spinning him sideways, but not stopping him. Thompson's return shot was wild, punching a hole in the adobe wall beside James's head. The second exchange came almost immediately. Both men fired together, the reports so close they sounded like a single thunderclap. Thompson staggered backward, a red stain spreading across his white shirt, while James felt fire tear through his thigh. But Thompson wasn't finished. Despite his wound, he raised his gun for a final shot, his face twisted with pain and fury. James threw himself sideways, his own Colt coming up in a smooth arc. The final shot was definitive. Thompson's head snapped back, his body crumpling to the floor as his unfired revolver clattered across the stone. James remained in position for several heartbeats, waiting to see if there were more men outside, but only silence greeted him. He limped to the window, checking the surrounding area carefully. Thompson's horses stood where they'd been left, but there was no sign of additional attackers. Either Thompson had been overconfident, or this had been intended as a quick snatch and grab rather than a siege. James bandaged his wounded leg with strips torn from his shirt, then called out to the children. Mary appeared first, emerging from the creek bed, with Samuel clinging to her side. Both children's faces were streaked with dirt and tears, but they were unharmed. "Is it over?" Mary asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded, though he suspected this was only the beginning. With Thompson dead, whoever had sent him would eventually send others. And Harold Mills was still out there, still in a position to foreclose on the ranch and leave them homeless. "For now," he said. "But we need to get to town. The sheriff needs to know what happened here." As they prepared to leave, Mary tugged at James's sleeve. "Mr. Walker, what Thompson said about Samuel, is it true?" James looked down at the little boy, who was staring at Thompson's body with solemn eyes. "I don't know, Mary. But if it is, there are going to be people who want to hurt him to get at that money." Mary's chin set with determination. "Then we'll have to protect him." The simple statement, delivered with absolute certainty, touched something deep in James's chest. This 7-year-old girl was prepared to stand against the world to protect her brother, just as he found himself prepared to stand with her. "Yes," he agreed quietly, "we will." The ride to Tombstone took 3 hours, James leading Thompson's horses, while Mary and Samuel rode double on his own mount. The children were quiet during the journey, Samuel still refusing to speak, while Mary maintained her protective vigilance. Tombstone was a bustling mining town that had grown up around silver strikes in the nearby hills. Its main street was lined with saloons, gambling halls, and businesses that catered to the rough men who worked the mines and ran cattle in the surrounding desert. It was also the seat of territorial government for this part of Arizona, which meant it had a sheriff, a judge, and other representatives of law and order. Sheriff Tom Bennett was a weathered man in his 50s who'd seen enough frontier violence to remain calm in almost any situation. He listened to James's account without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but making no judgments about the justification for the shooting. "Frank Thompson," Bennett mused when James finished. "Can't say I'm surprised he came to a bad end, though I didn't expect it to happen over a couple of kids." He studied Mary and Samuel, who sat quietly in chairs beside his desk. "You said he claimed the boy was heir to some fortune?" "That's what he said. Railroad and mining money, according to him." Bennett nodded thoughtfully. "There have been rumors about Thompson for years. Some folks said he had connections back east, people with serious money who weren't too particular about how their business got done out here." He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a telegram. "Matter of fact, I got this yesterday. Been meaning to ride out and talk to you about it." James accepted the telegram, reading it with growing unease. It was from a lawyer in Denver, inquiring about the whereabouts of one Samuel Collins, age 3, believed to be traveling with his mother Grace under assumed names. The boy was wanted for inheritance proceedings involving his deceased father's estate. "The Collins," James said slowly, "not Thompson. Could be the boy's real name," Bennett suggested. If his mother was hiding from someone, she might have used Thompson as an alias because of the way station connection. Mary had been listening intently, and now she spoke up. "Mama's real name was Grace Collins. She told me once when she thought I was sleeping. Said she'd almost forgotten it herself after using so many false ones." The confirmation sent a chill through James. If Samuel was indeed Samuel Collins, heir to a mining fortune, then Thompson's death wouldn't end their troubles. There would be lawyers, courts, distant relatives, and probably more men like Thompson, who saw a vulnerable child as an opportunity for easy money. "What do we do?" James asked. Bennett leaned back in his chair. "Well, first thing is to answer this telegram. Let them know the boy's been found. Second thing is to figure out who's got legal custody of him now that his mother's dead. Mary's his sister. That should count for something." "Maybe, but she's just a child herself. Courts generally want to see kids with adult guardians, especially when there's money involved." Bennett's expression grew serious. And there's another problem. Harold Mills was in here yesterday asking questions about you and making noises about foreclosure proceedings. Seems he's got some kind of investor interested in your property. James felt the familiar knot of dread in his stomach. Mills had been circling like a vulture for months, and now with Thompson dead and Samuel's value revealed, the banker would undoubtedly press his advantage. How long do I have? According to the paperwork he filed about 2 weeks before, he can legally seize the property for unpaid debts. Bennett hesitated. James, I got to ask. You planning to keep these kids? The question hung in the air between them. James looked at Mary and Samuel, these two children, who had somehow become his responsibility in the space of a single day. He thought about his empty house, his failed ranch, his debts and obligations that seemed to multiply faster than he could address them. Then he thought about Thompson's casual dismissal of Mary as expendable, about the cold calculation in the man's eyes when he'd spoken of Samuel's value. These children needed more than just shelter and food. They needed someone who would protect them from people who saw them as commodities to be exploited. Yes, he said simply. I am. Bennett nodded approvingly. Then we'd better figure out how to make it legal, and how to keep Harold Mills from throwing you all off your land while we're at it. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to James's ranch. He'd spent the night in town, staying at the hotel with the children, while Bennett sent telegrams to Denver and consulted with the territorial judge about custody arrangements. When they returned to the property, they found a buggy parked beside the well, and a woman in traveling clothes examining the damage from yesterday's gunfight. She was perhaps 40 years old, with graying brown hair pinned up in a practical style, and clothes that spoke of modest prosperity. When she turned to face them, James saw intelligent eyes and a face marked by years of hard work and responsibility. Mr. Walker, she asked, approaching with confident steps. I'm Rebecca Mills, Harold's sister-in-law. I believe we need to talk. The name Mills sent James's hand instinctively toward his gun, but the woman's manner was non-threatening, almost apologetic. She glanced at the children who had pressed close to James at the mention of the banker's name. I know what you're thinking, she said quickly. But I'm not here on Harold's behalf. In fact, I'm here because I disagree with what he's planning to do. James remained wary. What is he planning? Rebecca Mills sighed, looking genuinely troubled. My brother-in-law is not a bad man, Mr. Walker, but he's single-minded when it comes to business. He's made some kind of arrangement with investors from back east, people who want to buy up large tracts of land in this territory for development. Your property sits on one of the few reliable water sources in this area, which makes it extremely valuable to them. So he's going to foreclose and sell to these investors. That was the plan, yes. But yesterday's events have complicated matters. She glanced at the children again. Harold received a telegram this morning from Denver. It seems young Samuel here is worth considerably more than anyone realized. Mary stepped protectively in front of her brother. We don't want any old money. We just want to stay with Mr. Walker. Rebecca's expression softened. I understand, sweetheart. And that's why I'm here. She turned back to James. The lawyers in Denver have confirmed Samuel's identity and his inheritance. We're talking about more money than this territory sees in a year. Mining claims, railroad stock, real estate investments across 3 states. James felt a familiar dread settling in his stomach. And Mills wants to control that inheritance. Harold wants to be appointed as the boy's guardian, yes. He's already filed papers with the territorial court claiming that you're unfit to care for children due to your financial situation and other factors. What other factors? Rebecca looked uncomfortable. He's claiming you've been drinking heavily since your wife's death, that your property is unsafe, that you lack the resources to provide proper care for the children. She paused. He's also suggesting that yesterday's violence proves you're a danger to them. The injustice of it was breathtaking. James had risked his life to protect these children, and now that same protection was being used as evidence against him. But there's another option. Rebecca continued. Samuel's real father had a brother, a man named William Collins, who owns a mining operation near Denver. He's been searching for Samuel since his brother's death, and he's prepared to offer legal guardianship and full access to the inheritance. Mary's face paled. Another stranger who wants to take Samuel away. He's family, Rebecca said gently. And he has the resources to give Samuel everything he needs: education, security, a proper home. Samuel has a home, Mary said fiercely, right here with Mr. Walker and me. James found himself torn between practical necessity and growing attachment. The children would undoubtedly be better off with Collins. They'd have money, education opportunities he could never provide. But they'd also be separated from each other, thrust into a world of wealth and privilege that might not value the bond they shared. What does Collins want with Mary? He asked. Rebecca hesitated. Well, she's not blood family. He's willing to provide for her education and upbringing, but she'd be more like a ward than a daughter. The distinction was clear, and James could see that Mary understood it too. She would be tolerated, provided for out of duty, but never truly accepted as part of the family. Samuel would inherit millions, while Mary would remain dependent on the charity of strangers. No, James said firmly. They stay together or they don't go at all. Rebecca looked relieved. I was hoping you'd say that. You see, there's something Harold doesn't know. William Collins isn't the only family member looking for Samuel. There's also his aunt Margaret Collins, who lives in San Francisco. She's been searching for the children since she heard about her brother's death, and she's willing to recognize both children as family. She never married, never had children of her own, and she specifically requested that Samuel and Mary be placed together with a guardian who understands their bond. James felt a flicker of hope. What kind of guardian? Someone who's already proven he'll protect them. Someone they trust. Rebecca smiled. She's prepared to provide financial support for their care, including paying off your debts and providing funds for their education and upbringing. All she asks is that they be allowed to visit her once a year and that she be kept informed of their welfare. It sounded too good to be true, which in James's experience usually meant it was. What's the catch? The catch is that Harold has already filed his petition with the court, and he has considerable influence with Judge Morrison. If we're going to counter his claim, we need to move fast, and we need evidence that you're a suitable guardian. James thought about his empty larder, his unpaid debts, his isolation, and grief-driven neglect of basic responsibilities. I'm not sure what kind of evidence I can provide. Actually, you can provide the best kind, Rebecca said. Yesterday, when Frank Thompson and his men attacked your home, you defended these children with your life. Sheriff Bennett's report makes it clear that you acted heroically to protect them. That's exactly the kind of character evidence a judge wants to see. Over the next week, James found himself caught up in a whirlwind of legal proceedings and bureaucratic maneuvering. Margaret Collins arrived from San Francisco, proving to be a sharp-witted woman in her 60s, who took one look at Mary and Samuel and declared them exactly what my brother would have wanted his son to become. Strong, loyal, and unafraid of hard work. She also took one look at James's property and immediately hired contractors to make improvements. Within days, the small ranch was transformed. The adobe house was expanded and reinforced, a proper well was dug, fencing was repaired, and livestock was purchased to stock the newly green pastures. The children adapted to these changes with the resilience of youth. Mary threw herself into learning to read and write with Margaret Collins as her teacher, while Samuel began speaking more frequently, his vocabulary expanding as his sense of security grew. But Harold Mills wasn't giving up without a fight. He challenged Margaret Collins' claim to family status, questioned James's fitness as a guardian, and even suggested that the children might be safer in an orphanage until their status could be properly determined. The custody hearing was held in Tombstone's courthouse, a solid building that also served as the territorial seat for this part of Arizona. Judge Morrison presided, a stern man, known for his careful attention to legal precedent and his impatience with emotional appeals. Mills presented his case with smooth professionalism, painting James as an unstable drunk, living in squalor and endangering the children through his violent lifestyle. He produced witnesses who testified to James's debts, his isolation, and his involvement in the gunfight that had left 3 men dead. Your Honor, Mills concluded, these children deserve better than to be raised by a man who solves his problems with violence and can't even provide basic necessities for their care. Margaret Collins's attorney responded by calling Sheriff Bennett to testify about the circumstances of the gunfight, making it clear that James had acted in defense of the children rather than as an aggressor. Rebecca Mills also testified, describing her brother-in-law's financial motivations and his lack of genuine concern for the children's welfare. But the most effective testimony came from an unexpected source. Mary Collins, for that was her legal name now, took the stand despite her youth and spoke with quiet dignity about her mother's death, their desperate journey across the desert, and James's decision to help them when others had turned them away. Mr. Walker didn't have much food, she told the judge. But he shared what he had. He gave Samuel the biggest piece of bread, even though he was hungry too. Mama always said you can tell a good person by whether they share when they don't have much themselves. Samuel, still shy but no longer completely silent, was asked if he wanted to stay with James. His answer was simple and direct. Home, he said, pointing at James. Stay home. Judge Morrison deliberated for less than an hour before returning with his decision. While Mr. Mills's concerns about financial stability have merit, he announced, the evidence clearly shows that Mr. Walker has demonstrated both the character and commitment necessary to serve as guardian for these children. His actions in protecting them show a level of devotion that cannot be purchased with money or guaranteed by financial stability alone. The judge's gavel fell with finality. Custody is awarded to James Walker, with Margaret Collins designated as legal sponsor and financial guardian. The children will remain in Mr. Walker's care at his property, with regular reports to be filed regarding their welfare and education. Mills's face darkened with fury, but he accepted the decision with outward grace. As the courtroom emptied, however, he approached James with a final warning. This isn't over, Walker. There are other ways to get what I want, and next time you might not be so lucky. James met his gaze steadily. If you threaten these children again, Mills, you'll discover just how unlucky you can get. That evening, as they returned to the ranch that was now truly their home, Mary asked the question that had been troubling her since the hearing. Mr. Walker, what if more bad men come? What if they try to take Samuel again? James considered his answer carefully. The truth was that Samuel's inheritance would always make him a target for unscrupulous men. There would probably be other attempts, other dangers to face. But there would also be family resources and a community of people who cared about the children's welfare. Then we'll face them together, he said simply. All of us. That's what families do. Mary smiled, the expression transforming her serious face. Is that what we are now? A family? James looked at these 2 children who had wandered into his life like a desert mirage that turned out to be real. They'd brought him purpose, responsibility, and something he'd thought died with Sarah. Hope for the future. Yes, he said, and meant it completely. That's exactly what we are. 6 months later, the ranch had been transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to the broken man who'd once lived there alone. The house now boasted 4 rooms, a real kitchen, and windows that let in the desert light without the constant threat of attack. Cattle grazed in fenced pastures, chickens pecked in a proper coop, and a vegetable garden provided fresh food for the table. Mary had learned to read fluently and was working her way through every book Margaret Collins sent from San Francisco. Samuel spoke in complete sentences, now his vocabulary expanding daily as his confidence grew. Both children had gained weight and color, looking like the healthy youngsters they should have been all along. James himself had changed, perhaps most of all. The haunted look that had shadowed his eyes since Sarah's death had faded, replaced by the alert awareness of a man with responsibilities and reasons to face each day. He'd stopped drinking entirely, started attending church in town, and even began courting Rebecca Mills, whose quiet strength and practical wisdom had proven invaluable during the difficult months of establishing their new life. But the past wasn't entirely finished with them. Harold Mills had kept his word about finding other ways to pursue his goals, though his methods had become more subtle. He'd sold his share of the bank and left Tombstone, but rumors suggested he'd aligned himself with territorial politicians who shared his vision of large-scale development. There were whispers of railroad surveys, mining claims, and water rights disputes that could eventually threaten their peaceful existence. One evening, as James sat on the porch watching Mary teach Samuel to write letters in the dirt with a stick, Rebecca joined him with a letter that had arrived on the afternoon stage. "It's from Margaret," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "She's planning another visit next month, and she's bringing someone with her." James accepted the letter, reading it with growing interest. Margaret Collins had apparently been corresponding with other members of the Collins family people who'd been searching for Samuel since news of his inheritance had become public. Most of them seemed genuinely interested in the boy's welfare. But there were also suggestions of more complicated family dynamics and competing claims to guardianship. "She's bringing Samuel's cousin," James said, looking up from the letter. "A boy about 12 years old whose parents died in a railroad accident last year. She thinks he and Samuel should meet, maybe become friends." Rebecca nodded approvingly. "It would be good for both children to have family connections beyond just us adults. And if this boy needs a home too," the implication hung between them. Their family had already grown from one lonely man to include 2 children, and increasingly, Rebecca herself. Adding another child would stretch their resources and test their ability to provide proper care for everyone. But as James watched Mary patiently guide Samuel's small fingers around the shapes of letters, he realized that the decision had already been made in his heart. They'd started this journey by sharing the last piece of bread with hungry children. If another child needed what they could offer, how could they turn him away? "We'll make room," he said simply. "Somehow we always do." Rebecca smiled, reaching over to take his hand. "I was hoping you'd say that." Margaret also mentioned that the family has established a trust fund for Samuel's education and future needs. It's enough to ensure he'll never want for anything, but it's also structured so that it can't be easily stolen or misused by unscrupulous guardians. James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. One of his greatest fears had been that he'd prove inadequate to provide for Samuel's future, that his own limitations would somehow hold the boy back from reaching his potential. Knowing that Samuel's inheritance was secure and properly managed removed that burden. "What about Mary?" he asked. "Margaret's included her in the trust as well. Not as an heir exactly, but as family. She'll have the same opportunities for education and advancement as Samuel, with the understanding that they're to be treated as equals in all things." The generosity was overwhelming. But James had learned to accept help gracefully over the past months. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford when children's futures were at stake. As the sun set over the desert painting, the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, James reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. A year ago, he'd been a broken man, waiting to die alone. Now he was the center of a growing family with responsibilities and joys he'd never imagined possible. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention. A single rider was approaching from the direction of town, moving at a steady pace that suggested routine business rather than emergency. As the figure drew closer, James recognized Dr. Harrison, the territory's circuit physician, who made regular rounds to check on families in remote areas. "Evening, James," the doctor called as he dismounted. Rebecca, thought I'd stop by and check on the children, see how they're settling in. Dr. Harrison had been instrumental in documenting the children's condition when they'd first arrived, providing medical evidence of their neglect and abuse that had helped establish James's case for custody. His regular visits were partly professional and partly personal. He'd become genuinely fond of Mary and Samuel. "They're doing well," Rebecca said, gesturing toward the children who had stopped their writing lesson to watch the visitor. "Growing like weeds and eating us out of house and home." The doctor smiled. "That's exactly what we want to hear. Mind if I take a look at them? Just routine checks, nothing to worry about." Over the next hour, Dr. Harrison examined both children thoroughly, pronouncing them healthy and well-nourished. Samuel had gained nearly 10 pounds since his arrival, while Mary had grown 2 inches and lost the hollow-cheeked appearance of chronic hunger. "You've done good work here," the doctor told James privately. These children were in bad shape when they first arrived, not just physically, but emotionally. They've made remarkable progress. "They're strong kids," James replied. "They just needed someone to give them a chance." Dr. Harrison nodded, then grew more serious. "James, I need to tell you something. I've been hearing rumors and town stories about men asking questions about you and the children. Nothing specific, but enough to make me think you should be careful." James felt the familiar chill of danger. "What kind of men?" "Strangers, well-dressed, asking about property records and legal documents. Could be lawyers, could be something else. Sheriff Bennett's aware of it, but he thought you should know too." The news didn't surprise James, but it did remind him that their peaceful interlude might be temporary. Samuel's inheritance would always attract attention from people who saw opportunity in a vulnerable child, and there would probably always be men like Frank Thompson willing to use violence to get what they wanted. "I'll be careful," James promised, "and I'll make sure the children are protected." After Dr. Harrison left, James spent a long time sitting on the porch thinking about the future and the challenges it might bring. Rebecca had gone inside to help the children prepare for bed, and he could hear their voices through the open windows. Mary reading aloud from one of her books, while Samuel listened with rapt attention. These were the sounds of home, a family of a life worth protecting. Whatever dangers lay ahead, whatever schemes men like Harold Mills might devise, James was no longer the broken man who'd once contemplated ending his own life. He had reasons to fight now, people who depended on him and the kind of purpose that could sustain a man through any hardship. When Rebecca rejoined him on the porch, she found him cleaning his rifle with the methodical care of a man who understood its importance. "Expecting trouble?" she asked quietly. "Always," James replied, "but also expecting to handle it." She settled beside him, comfortable in the silence that stretched between them. After a while, she spoke again. Margaret's letter mentioned something else. "She's been in contact with a lawyer in Denver who specializes in territorial law. He thinks there might be ways to establish legal protections for the children that would make it much harder for people like Mills to challenge their custody in the future." James looked up from his rifle. "What kind of protections?" "Formal adoption papers, for one thing. Right now, you're their guardian, but adoption would make you their legal father in every sense. It would also establish Mary's status as Samuel's sister beyond any question, which could be important if other family members try to separate them." The idea of formal adoption was both appealing and terrifying. It would give him the legal authority to protect the children more effectively, but it would also make him fully responsible for their futures in ways that went beyond simple guardianship. "What do you think?" he asked. Rebecca smiled. "I think those children already consider you their father in every way that matters. The legal papers would just make it official." Before James could respond, the sound of Mary's voice called from inside the house. "Mr. Walker, Samuel had a bad dream. He wants you to check under his bed for monsters." James set aside his rifle and stood feeling the familiar warmth that came with being needed by someone who trusted him completely. "Coming," he called back, then looked at Rebecca. "We'll talk about the adoption papers tomorrow." Right now I have monsters to chase away." As he headed inside to comfort a frightened child, James reflected on how much his life had changed. A year ago, he'd been fighting his own monsters: grief, guilt, despair, and the temptation to give up entirely. Now he was fighting different battles, but ones with clear purposes and achievable goals. He found Samuel sitting up in his small bed, eyes wide with the kind of fear that only made sense to a 3-year-old mind. Mary sat beside him, holding his hand and whispering reassurances, but the boy clearly wanted the additional security that only James could provide. "What kind of monsters are we dealing with here?" James asked seriously, kneeling beside the bed. Samuel pointed under the bed with a trembling finger. "Big ones, with teeth." James made a show of examining the space under the bed thoroughly, even getting down on his hands and knees to peer into the shadows. "Well, I don't see any monsters right now, but you know what? I think they're probably afraid of something." "What are they afraid of?" Samuel asked, his fear beginning to give way to curiosity. "Families," James said simply. "Monsters don't like places where people take care of each other. They prefer places where folks are alone and scared. Since you've got Mary to watch over you and me to chase away the monsters, I don't think they'll bother coming around here anymore." Samuel considered this explanation with the seriousness it deserved and then nodded. "Will you stay until I fall asleep?" "Of course." James settled into the chair beside Samuel's bed, while Mary returned to her own room. As the boy's breathing gradually slowed and sleep claimed him, James found himself thinking about monsters. The real ones that threatened children like Samuel and Mary. Men like Frank Thompson and Harold Mills weren't motivated by supernatural evil, but by greed, selfishness, and the kind of cruelty that saw children as commodities to be exploited. They were monsters of a different kind, but no less dangerous for being human. But James had learned something important over the past months. Monsters could be defeated. It took courage, determination, and sometimes violence, but they could be stopped. And the best defense against monsters wasn't weapons or walls, but exactly what he'd told Samuel. Families, communities, people who cared enough to stand together against those who would prey on the vulnerable. As Samuel finally settled into peaceful sleep, James made a silent promise. Whatever monsters came hunting for these children, they would find him standing in their way. He was no longer the broken man who'd once lived alone with his grief. He was a father now, with all the fierce protectiveness that title implied. And he would let no harm come to his children, no matter what the cost. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Sheriff Bennett arrived at dawn with a telegram that had come in on the overnight wire from Denver. Margaret Collins was dead, killed in a carriage accident while traveling to meet with lawyers about Samuel's inheritance. The news hit the family like a physical blow. Margaret had become more than just a financial sponsor. She'd been a friend, a wise counselor, and the closest thing to a grandmother the children had ever known. Her death left them not only grieving, but potentially vulnerable to new legal challenges. "What happens now?" Rebecca asked after Bennett had left, and they'd broken the news to Mary and Samuel. James studied the telegram, looking for clues about their future. "According to this, Margaret named me as Samuel's legal guardian in her will with full authority over his inheritance until he comes of age. But there are other family members who might challenge that arrangement." The implications were troubling. Without Margaret's protection and advocacy, they could face renewed attempts by people like Harold Mills to gain control of Samuel's fortune. The boy's inheritance was simply too large to escape notice from those who saw opportunity in a vulnerable child. Over the next few days, more details emerged. Margaret's will was indeed comprehensive, establishing James as Samuel's guardian and ensuring Mary's inclusion in the family's financial support. But it also revealed the existence of other Collins relatives who had their own ideas about what was best for the children. A second cousin named Edmund Collins arrived from St. Louis within a week of Margaret's death. He was a lawyer himself, smooth-spoken and expensively dressed, with the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of getting his way through intimidation and manipulation. "Mr. Walker," he said, settling into the parlor of James's expanded house with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to being deferred to. "I'm sure you understand that recent events have created a new situation regarding young Samuel's care." James remained standing, unwilling to grant this stranger the courtesy of equal seating. Margaret's will was very clear about her wishes. Indeed it was. But Margaret was an old woman, possibly not entirely competent when she made those arrangements. A court might well decide that Samuel would be better served by family members with more appropriate backgrounds and resources. The threat was politely delivered, but unmistakable. Edmund Collins had the legal knowledge and financial resources to challenge James's guardianship, and he was clearly prepared to do so. "What do you want?" James asked bluntly. Collins smiled thinly. "I want what's best for the boy naturally. Samuel is a Collins heir to a substantial fortune that requires proper management. He needs education, social connections, preparation for the responsibilities that come with wealth and position. He needs a family that loves him. Love is a luxury, Mr. Walker. Samuel needs practical preparation for his future role as head of the Collins business interests." Collins leaned forward. "I'm prepared to offer you substantial compensation for releasing your claim to guardianship. Enough to buy a proper ranch, perhaps even enough to retire comfortably." James felt the familiar anger rising in his chest. Another man trying to buy his way to Samuel's inheritance, another attempt to treat the children as commodities to be traded. "And Mary," Collins shrugged dismissively. "The girl isn't family. She can remain with you if you're so attached to her, though I hardly see why you'd want the burden of raising someone else's child." The casual cruelty of the dismissal made James's hands clench into fists. This man saw Mary as nothing more than an inconvenience, a complication to be disposed of in pursuit of his real goal. "Get out," James said quietly. "I beg your pardon. I said get out. Off my property, away from my children, and don't come back." Collins's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, Walker. I have resources you can't imagine, connections in territorial government legal expertise that will crush any amateur resistance you might mount. Samuel will be placed in my custody one way or another. We'll see about that." After Collins left, James found Mary sitting on the back porch, obviously having overheard the conversation. Her face was pale but determined, showing the same resolve that had carried her across the desert to find help for her brother. "He wants to take Samuel away, doesn't he?" she asked. James sat beside her, choosing his words carefully. "He wants to try. But wanting and doing are two different things. Will you fight him like you fought the bad man who came before?" James considered the question seriously. Fighting Frank Thompson had been a matter of immediate physical danger, resolved with violence and courage. Fighting Edmund Collins would require different weapons. Legal knowledge, political connections, financial resources that James wasn't sure he possessed. "I'll fight him," James promised. "But this kind of fight is different. It happens in courtrooms and lawyers' offices, not with guns and fists." Mary nodded solemnly. "Mama always said the worst fights were the ones where you couldn't see the enemy clearly." The observation was unsettlingly mature for a 7-year-old. But then Mary had been forced to mature far beyond her years. She understood better than most children that the world contained people who would hurt others for their own gain. "Where's Samuel?" James asked. "Inside, with Rebecca practicing his letters. He don't know about the man who wants to take him away." James was grateful for Rebecca's presence. Over the past months, she'd become an integral part of their family, providing the kind of maternal guidance and emotional support the children needed. The possibility of losing Samuel would devastate her almost as much as it would James and Mary. That evening, after the children were asleep, James and Rebecca sat in their kitchen planning their defense against Edmund Collins' challenge. Rebecca had been researching territorial law, trying to understand the legal framework that would govern any custody dispute. The good news is that Margaret's will gives us a strong legal foundation, she reported. James is named specifically as guardian, with clear instructions about his authority and responsibilities. Collins would have to prove that Margaret was incompetent when she wrote the will, or that James is unfit to serve as guardian. And the bad news: Collins has significant legal expertise and financial resources. He can probably afford to tie this up in court for years, making it expensive and exhausting to fight him. Plus, there's always the possibility that a judge might decide Samuel would be better off with blood family. James thought about the hearing where he'd first been granted custody, remembering Judge Morrison's emphasis on character and commitment over financial resources. But that had been a territorial court dealing with orphaned children of unknown background. A custody fight over an heir to millions might be decided by different criteria. Now, what do we need to do? Rebecca consulted her notes. First, we need our own lawyer. Someone who understands territorial law and has experience with custody cases. Second, we need to document everything that shows James is a good guardian. The children's health, their education, their emotional well-being. Third, we need to find out more about Edmund Collins and his motivations. The last point was crucial. In James's experience, men like Collins usually had vulnerabilities. Financial pressures, personal scandals, legal troubles that could be exposed if someone dug deep enough. The key was finding leverage that could convince him to withdraw his challenge. Over the next week, they set their plans in motion. Rebecca traveled to Tucson to consult with lawyers, while James remained at the ranch with the children maintaining their normal routine, while quietly preparing for the legal battle ahead. The children seemed to sense the tension despite James's efforts to shield them from adult concerns. Samuel became quieter and more clingy, while Mary asked increasingly pointed questions about why strangers kept coming to talk about their future. "Are we going to have to leave?" she asked one evening as James tucked her into bed. "I hope not," he answered honestly. "But if we do have to go, we'll go together. All of us. That's a promise." Mary seemed satisfied with this assurance, but James knew the reality was more complicated. If Edmund Collins succeeded in gaining custody of Samuel, there would be no legal way to prevent the boy's removal from their family. The best James could hope for would be visitation rights and the ability to maintain some connection as Samuel grew up. The thought of losing the boy who became his son in all but legal terms was almost unbearable. Over the past months, James had watched Samuel transform from a traumatized silent child into a bright, curious boy who was beginning to trust the world again. The idea of placing him in the care of a cold, calculating man like Collins felt like a betrayal of everything Margaret had intended. But James had learned not to surrender to despair. He'd faced impossible odds before and found ways to survive and protect those who depended on him. Whatever legal challenges lay ahead, he would meet them with the same determination that had carried him through war loss and the desperate fight against Frank Thompson. The first major development came when Rebecca returned from Tucson with disturbing news. She'd hired a lawyer named David Morrison. Judge Morrison's son, who had inherited his father's sharp legal mind, along with his commitment to justice. But Morrison had also uncovered troubling information about Edmund Collins and his business practices. Collins isn't just a lawyer, Rebecca reported as they sat around the kitchen table after the children were asleep. He's been involved in several questionable deals over the past few years. Land acquisitions that displaced Native American tribes, mining claims that may have been obtained through fraud railroad contracts that involved bribing territorial officials. James absorbed this information with grim satisfaction. So he's crooked, probably, but he's also careful. Nothing that's been proven in court, nothing that would automatically disqualify him as a guardian. But Morrison thinks we might be able to use his reputation to raise questions about his motivations. What else did Morrison say about our chances? Rebecca's expression grew more serious. He's optimistic, but realistic. The fact that Margaret chose James specifically combined with the children's obvious well-being under his care gives us a strong case. But Collins has resources and connections that could influence the outcome. The legal battle began in earnest 2 weeks later, when Collins filed formal papers challenging James's guardianship and requesting custody of Samuel. The case was assigned to Judge William Hayes, a territorial appointee known for his strict interpretation of law and his suspicion of emotional appeals. Morrison prepared their defense, meticulously gathering testimony from Dr. Harrison about the children's improved health, from Sheriff Bennett about James's character, and from various community members who could speak to his fitness as a guardian. He also quietly investigated Collins' background, looking for anything that might undermine his credibility. The hearing itself was held in Tucson's Territorial Courthouse, the imposing building that represented the growing influence of federal authority in the Arizona Territory. James, Rebecca, and the children made the journey together, staying in a hotel near the courthouse while the legal proceedings unfolded. Collins presented his case with professional competence, arguing that Samuel needed the advantages that only wealth and social position could provide. He painted James as a well-meaning but ultimately inadequate guardian, a man whose frontier background and limited education made him unsuitable to prepare Samuel for his future responsibilities. The boy will inherit mining operations, railroad holdings, and real estate investments across 3 territories, Collins told the judge. He needs preparation for leadership roles in major business enterprises, education at the finest schools, social connections that will serve him throughout his life. Mr. Walker, despite his admirable intentions, simply cannot provide these advantages. Morrison's response focused on the children's emotional well-being and the bonds they'd formed as a family. He called Mary to testify, and her simple, direct answers about her love for James and her fear of being separated from Samuel clearly moved the judge. Mr. Collins says Samuel needs to learn about business, Mary said when asked about the future. But Samuel needs to learn about being happy first. He just started talking again, and he smiles now when he didn't before. That seems more important than business to me. Samuel himself was too young to testify formally, but Morrison arranged for the judge to observe him interacting with James and Rebecca. The boy's obvious comfort and affection were powerful evidence of the family bonds that had developed. The turning point came when Morrison presented evidence about Collins' business practices. While none of the allegations rose to the level of criminal activity, they painted a picture of a man who valued profit over people and who had a history of exploiting vulnerable populations for financial gain. Your Honor, Morrison argued, the question before this court is not whether Samuel Collins deserves the advantages that wealth can provide. The question is whether he deserves to be raised by people who love him and have proven their commitment to his welfare, or whether he should be placed with a distant relative whose primary interest appears to be controlling his inheritance. Judge Hayes deliberated for 2 days before announcing his decision. When court reconvened, the courtroom was packed with spectators who had followed the case with intense interest. This case presents a fundamental question about the nature of family and the responsibilities of guardianship. The judge began. While Mr. Collins' arguments about financial advantages have merit, the evidence clearly shows that the children's emotional and developmental needs are being met exceptionally well under Mr. Walker's care. James felt his heart pounding as the judge continued. More importantly, Margaret Collins' will demonstrates a clear understanding of her nephew's needs and a deliberate choice about who should provide for those needs. This court sees no compelling reason to overturn the considered judgment of a woman who knew both the children and the available options intimately. The gavel fell with finality. Custody remains with James Walker, with all provisions of Margaret Collins' will to remain in effect. The victory was complete, but James felt no sense of triumph, only profound relief. As they left the courthouse, Collins approached them one final time. "This isn't over, Walker," he said quietly. "There are other legal remedies, other family members who might be interested in Samuel's welfare." "Bring them on," James replied. "We'll be ready." But Collins's threat proved to be empty bluster. Within a month, word reached them that the lawyer had been arrested in St. Louis on charges related to fraudulent mining claims. His legal practice was in ruins, and his ability to challenge their custody had evaporated, along with his reputation. 6 months later, James stood in the same courthouse where they'd fought for their family's survival. But this time, the occasion was celebratory. Judge Hayes was presiding over formal adoption proceedings that would make James legally the father of both Mary and Samuel Collins Walker. The children had chosen their new names themselves, wanting to honor both their birth family and their new one. Samuel, now 4 years old and talking constantly, had solemnly declared that he wanted to be Samuel Collins Walker, son of James. Mary had chosen simply Mary Walker, saying that she was ready to belong completely to their new family. Rebecca stood beside them as the proceedings concluded, wearing a simple wedding dress and a smile that seemed to light up the entire courtroom. She and James had married 2 months earlier, completing the transformation of their makeshift family into something recognized by both law and community. The adoption ceremony was brief but meaningful. Judge Hayes spoke about the responsibilities and privileges of parenthood, about the bonds that were being formalized, but had existed in practice for over a year. When he pronounced them officially a family, Samuel clapped his hands with delight, while Mary wiped away tears of joy. Afterward, as they walked out of the courthouse into the bright Arizona sunshine, James reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 years earlier, he'd been a broken man, living alone with his grief, convinced that his life held no further purpose or meaning. Now he was the father of 2 remarkable children, and the husband of a woman who had brought stability and love back into his world. The ranch that had once been a symbol of failure and loss had become a thriving home where children's laughter echoed across the desert, and the future held promise instead of merely obligation. Samuel tugged at his sleeve, demanding attention with the imperious manner of a 4-year-old. "Papa James, can we go home now? I want to show Mama Rebecca how I can write my new name." The word Papa still sent a warm current through James's chest. Samuel had started using it months ago, but it never failed to remind him of the miraculous transformation that had brought them together. "Yes, son," he said, lifting the boy onto his shoulders. "Let's go home." As they climbed into the wagon for the journey back to their ranch, Mary settled beside him with the quiet contentment that had replaced her earlier wariness. "Papa James," she said, testing the formal name she'd recently adopted, "do you think Mama would be proud of our family?" The question might have referred to either of the women who had shaped her life. Grace Collins, who had died protecting her children, or Sarah Walker, whose grave on the hill overlooked their expanding ranch. James suspected Mary meant both. "I think they'd both be very proud," he said, meaning it completely. "And I think they'd be happy to know you're safe and loved." Mary nodded, satisfied with this answer. As the wagon rolled across the desert toward home, James found himself thinking about the strange currents of fate that had brought them together. A gunshot in the desert, 2 hungry children at his door, and a series of challenges that had tested every assumption he'd held about family responsibility, and the possibility of second chances. The inheritance that had made Samuel a target would always be part of their lives. But it had also provided security and opportunities that James could never have given them alone. Samuel would grow up with advantages that few frontier children enjoyed, but he would also grow up with the values that came from a family forged in hardship and sealed with genuine love. As the sun set behind them, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, James allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. Complete contentment with the present and genuine optimism about the future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever new threats might emerge to test their family's strength, they would face them together. And that, James had learned, was the strongest foundation any family could have. The ranch came into view as darkness fell, its windows glowing with warm lamplight that promised safety, comfort, and the kind of peace that could only come from being truly home. As they pulled into the yard, Samuel's excited chatter about showing off his writing skills filled the evening air, while Mary quietly helped Rebecca gather their things from the courthouse trip. These were the sounds and rhythms of family life, ordinary moments made precious by the journey that had brought them together. James Walker, once a man who had lost everything, now found himself rich beyond measure in the things that truly mattered. As he lifted his son from the wagon and took his daughter's hand to walk toward their front door, James silently thanked whatever force had brought these children to his threshold on that desperate night so long ago. They had come seeking food and shelter, but they had given him something far more valuable in return. A reason to live a purpose worth fighting for, and the kind of love that could transform even the most broken soul. Behind them, the desert stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars, vast and unforgiving as it had always been. But within the circle of light, cast by their home's windows, a family had found each other against all odds, and chosen to build something lasting from the raw materials of hope, determination, and love. And in the end, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.